Hello, welcome, welcome once again to everyone watching on Zoom and on Facebook to the Riverwood Conservancy's latest webinar, A Visit to the Galapagos Islands Part 2. My name is Rashid Clark. I'm the marketing specialist at the Riverwood Conservancy. Hope you're doing well and staying safe, and thank you for joining us tonight from wherever you are. And thank you as well to Credit Valley Conservation for their support in making this webinar possible. To learn more about their work at cvc.ca. And if you'd like to support our environmental work both in Riverwood and around the world virtually through events like this, we'd very much appreciate a donation, which you can make at theriverwoodconservancy.org. Again, we are broadcasting live on Zoom and on our Facebook page. If you have questions, comments at any point, please drop them into the comments if you're on Facebook, and drop them into the Q&A tab if you're watching us on Zoom. We'll get to as many questions as we can tonight. And a little bit more about our presenter, Dr. Barbara Burke, geologist by training, who completed her undergraduate degree at Princeton University and her graduate degree at the University of Toronto. For the past 10 years, Professor Burke has co-taught a field course in Ecuador for the University of Toronto's Summer Abroad program, which sees students spend 1 month in the field studying geology, ecology, environmental science, and international development in the Andes, the Amazon, and the Galapagos Islands. So that's enough for me. I'll turn things over to you, Barbara.
Awesome, thanks a lot. I will just share my screen right there. And thanks very much, Rashid. And thanks for hosting and looking after all the technical stuff. So I think I'm gonna probably just kind of skip over introducing myself. Rashid more or less said all of this anyway. And I'm kind of figuring that a lot of you were here last time. If you were not, don't worry, you'll be able to follow along, okay? I'll just mention again that, you know, I have some scholarly cred with regard to talking about the Galapagos Islands, but a lot of it is just brute force through spending a lot of time in the past 10 years. I've been to the islands about 12 or 13 times, mostly with Summer Abroad for the University of Toronto, and I have the privilege every year of taking a group of about 25 University of Toronto students down to the islands, and we also visit the Amazon rainforest, the cloud forest, and the Andes, and it's pretty life-changing. Unfortunately, we weren't able to go last summer and not again this year, but we look forward to getting back there as soon as possible. So last time, I proposed that we would cover 4 questions, these 4 questions right here, and we made it through the first 2 questions, and I made it through with 1 minute to spare last time. And the 2 questions that we looked at last time were, where did the islands come from? So if you recall, those of you who were here last time, we talked about the islands being part of a volcanic hotspot, an oceanic chain of islands, very similar geologically to Hawaii and Tahiti, and there's several other examples of this type of thing. So they're basically a chain of volcanic islands. And then we also talked about how the animals and plants got there and a little bit about what happened to some of them after they got there. For example, we talked about some of the kind of amazing innovations that some organisms have evolved subsequent to arriving in the islands, like the ability of the marine iguanas to deal with a saltwater environment and the adaptive radiation of the finches. And you'll recall that we also talked about some of the odd characteristics that island biota have. And I'll come back to that today at the end, if I make it. So bad form, I just want to tell you that I've got a little too much to cover. So we're just going to have a wild tour here, and we're going to get through as much as we can. And I hope that I can make it through everything. Just so much interesting stuff to talk about with the islands. And so the 2 questions that I wanted to address today, first of all, how did the people get there? And then what's it like in the islands today? And of course, those 2 questions are very much interrelated, because much of what it's like in the islands today has to do with balancing the impacts of people, both the inhabitants of the islands and, of course, the tourists. So here again is our beautiful pictures tweeted from the International Space Station by Commander Hadfield, showing some of the islands. This big one that I still maintain is shaped like a seahorse, lying down in this case, is the big island of Isabella. Fernandina is here, and then a bunch of other islands going off in that direction. And what you can see here, if you recall, we talked about this last time, the island of Isabella is basically a series of volcanic cones that are all more or less melded together. And I said last time that there's at least 127 islands. Actually, the Parque Nacional Galapagos says 330, so I'm not quite sure whose estimate is right. Remember that even a little rock that's poking its head above the level of the ocean has to go all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. So even the tiniest little islands actually have a bit of substance behind them. So at least 127 islands, and there's human presence on 5 of them. And you'll recall from last time that I said that the current hotspot, the volcanic hotspot, the plume of hot material that's coming up through the mantle, up from way down in near the core of the Earth, up through the mantle and poking up through the crust and making these volcanic islands, is located right here under the islands of Isabella and Fernandina. And then there is a chain of islands that's been carried off the hotspot in that direction towards the coast of South America. Those islands are now volcanically extinct, and they get older and smaller as they move off of the hotspot. And you'll recall that there also, surprisingly, is this other chain of islands that's moving off in that direction from the hotspot. And remember that that's related to the movement of the Cocos Plate. So here's the Galapagos Islands here. Here's the movement of the Nazca Plate going towards the mainland of South America, and then the Cocos Plate going off in this direction towards Central America, creating this other ridge of islands that is sort of like another leg of the Galapagos. And here's our map again. So just reviewing again from last time, the big island here, Isabella, shaped like a seahorse. And remember, these are our 5 islands that have a human presence. The first one being, the smallest one being Baltra, which I don't even know if there are people who live there full time, but the main island, the main airport is on Baltra, which is also called South Seymour. And in a little while, I'll talk about why the island of Baltra hosts the main airport. It seems a little odd, a little tiny rock like this that's separated by a whole island from the biggest settlement in Galapagos, which is Puerto Ayora here in Santa Cruz. That's the biggest one, and then in between we have the town here on Isabella, on Floriana, and on San Cristobal. And also notice I mentioned this last time that the islands mostly have at least 2 names. Some of them have 3 names, and we'll touch again on why that is in this presentation today. Now, if you were among those who thought that the islands were sparsely inhabited or maybe uninhabited, maybe no people permanently living there at all, that's not an uncommon view. And I just want to reassure you that you're not alone. Also, that view of the islands as sort of a pristine, uninhabited, untouched by people, natural environment has been very carefully crafted. This is the island of Bartolome. It's kind of the iconic view in Galapagos. Probably if I had to pick a try not to miss it thing, it would be Bartolome. This idea of the islands as pristine and untouched by people has been, as I said, carefully crafted over the years since tourism first started in the islands in the 1960s. You can look at old tourist posters and even some of the more modern tourist posters. This is a poster ad campaign from Metropolitan Touring, which is the agency that actually started tourism in the islands in the 1960s. And you very rarely see any sign of human habitation at all. If you see any people, it's usually tourists. These 2, by the way, are too close. They're not supposed to be that close, although sometimes with sea lions you can't help it because they come up to you. And so, as I said, the narrative here has been a conscious effort to create a narrative of Galapagos as a pristine place. We don't want people in the equation. We want to give the impression of Galapagos as a pristine, untouched natural laboratory. I didn't come up with that idea. I have to give credit for that idea and that whole story, which is a very interesting and complex history, to my friend Diego Quiroga, who is a social anthropologist who's done a lot of work about this whole narrative of Galapagos and how it has evolved over the decades and really over the centuries, as you'll see. So even today, if you Google just Galapagos Islands, is what I put into this Google search, I mean, the first few that come up, not too much sign of people as far as I can tell. There's a canoe here. This right here is a viewing platform, and we got a few tourists in the background here. Basically, people are just not in the equation. And even in the really most modern tourist campaign of Ecuador as a country, all you need is Ecuador, there's not a whole lot of evidence of people, not just in Galapagos, actually. That's kind of the narrative in all four of the main regions of Ecuador, the Amazon, the Andes, the coast, and the islands. So if you look really closely here, you can see there actually is a cruise ship here, but it's kind of cleverly disguised as a rock. And nevertheless, there are more than 26,000 people living in the islands. It's a little bit hard to pin down the actual population because people do a lot of coming and going. They have now stopped immigration altogether. Even if you're Ecuadorian, you cannot move to the islands and just decide that you're going to stay there. I mean, there's some ways around it, the main one being marry a Galapagonian, but for the most part, you can't go on a vacation in Galapagos and decide, yeah, this is my place, I'm going to stay here. It's probably not happening. But it is true, however, that these 26,000 people are kind of clustered in a pretty small area. They're clustered in mostly those 4 settlements that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and 96 to 97% of the actual land area of the islands is national park. So this kind of simultaneously complicates and simplifies life for people who want to travel in the islands. The main reason being, you're not allowed to go into the park on your own. You have to have a guide, you have to be with a guide, and guides can have no more than 16 people with them in a group. So that seems, kind of complicated, but actually not really, because you got to go with a guide, so you might as well go with a guide, and this is why I say, and we can talk about this afterwards if anyone wants to talk about, I have lots of opinions about the best ways to travel in the islands, and I've done a lot of different ways of traveling in the islands, and, I kind of think it is one of those circumstances where signing up for a tour is not a bad idea. It takes some of the complexity out of it. So put your seatbelts on. We're going to take a really fast tour through the history of human habitation in the islands. And the first one, I mentioned this briefly last time, is that there's no evidence of pre-Hispanic indigenous presence in the islands. None. And people have really, really looked. And like I said, I have some friends who are among the anthropologists and archaeologists who've done the most work in the island. Oh my goodness, let me tell you. They would really like to find evidence of pre-Hispanic indigenous people in the islands. There is nothing. Now, some of you will recall Thor Heyerdahl, who was, I'm going to say Norwegian explorer, and he made this raft right here called Kon-Tiki, and he took off from the coast of South America, and he sort of followed some of these ocean currents, and he made it clear that it would have been entirely possible for pre-Hispanic people to make it to the islands. He actually even visited Galapagos. Not sure if he visited on this first tour, but he did get there. And you'll remember that I mentioned this guy. If you've been to Floriana, you probably went on the little walking tour that goes up into the hills, and your guide may have shown you this guy who's carved out of a rock up in the hills. And your guide might have even said that this is evidence of pre-Hispanic presence, but it most certainly isn't. It was carved much, much later. There is actually a connection between this guy and Thor Heyerdahl, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. There also are Incan legends that say that Tupac Inca Yupanqui discovered it's actually known that he went on an expedition, a 10-month expedition. I'm not sure if he went, but he sponsored a 10-month expedition by boat and discovered evidently 2 islands, which he named Nina Chumpi and Ahua Chumpi, Fire Island and Outer Island, in the 1480s. So this was, I think he was the second to last Inca emperor. And so Fire Island, Outer Island, that seems like could be Galapagos. And some people do still think that these are references to the Galapagos Islands and to the Incas having been there. Let me reiterate, there is no actual evidence that the Incas ever made it to the islands. As well, in the accounts of this expedition, they referred to bringing back slaves, gold, which there isn't any in the islands. It's a big pile of volcanic rock. They referred to bringing back a brass chair and the hide and bones of a horse. So, you know, those accounts of the expedition don't fit really well with Galapagos. I think the consensus is that uh, his explorers might well have made it to some South Pacific islands, but not Galapagos. There are indigenous Ecuadorians in the islands today, but they're not indigenous to the islands. They're immigrants from the mainland, relatively recent immigrants. They've come in the past 1 or 2 or 3 generations, and some of them come from coastal communities, and some of them have come from more inland communities on the mainland. The first recorded discovery of the islands was by Tomas de Berlanga, who was at the time the Bishop of Panama, and he was on a expedition for the King of Spain, and he stumbled upon the islands in 1535. He was not enchanted with the islands and got out of there pretty much as fast as he could, and wrote of them that it looked as though at some time God had showered stones about. The islands were then discovered again in 1546, also by accident, by Diego de Rivadeneira, who was the person who named them the Enchanted Islands, Islas Encantadas, and you still see that nickname, you know, used. The only thing is that people misinterpret it. So people think that he meant Enchanted Islands as if he liked them. He also did not like them. And what he really meant by Islas Encantadas was that he thought that the islands were bewitched. The Galapagos Islands are often shrouded in fog, which is locally referred to as garua. And so they came upon these islands. It was a bunch of, you know, black rock, and they were shrouded in mist. They actually thought the islands might be floating, and that idea carried on for quite a long time. And they actually were afraid to go ashore. Partly they were afraid to go ashore because they were worried that their compatriots would leave them there. So he also kind of beat it out of there as quickly as he could. In 1574, the islands appeared in the World Atlas for the first time, a map put together by a Flemish cartographer named Ortelius, and he's the same person who gave them their name, the name Galapagos, which comes from an old Spanish word for saddle. And this was because the shells of one couple of species of the Galapagos tortoises have this sort of dent in the middle, and it reminded them of a saddle. So here is the map, a little bit closer view of the map of Ortelius, and if you look really, really closely, right over here, you can see that it says Islas de los Galapagos. So that was the very first appearance of the islands on any kind of official map. We then go into a period of time when the islands were visited by English explorers and navigators, and of note was William Cowley. He visited the islands a couple of times in 1683 and 1684, and he produced the first really detailed, accurate, navigable charts of the islands, one of which is shown here by Captain Cowley in 1684. And one of the interesting things that you can see on this map is the names. So he gave them all English names. And so, for example, here we have the island called the Duke of Albemarle's Island. This, of course, is the top part of Isabella. And you might remember from that earlier map that the other name of Isabella is Albemarle. And then if we look over here, you can see we have King Charles Island. And this Charles is one of the other names of the island Floriana, and so on. So that's how the islands got their actually first names. They were English names that were given to them mostly by Cowley, and then later they were given Spanish names after Ecuador took them over in the 1800s. And we then go into a long period from the late 1500s and into the early 1700s, when pirates and buccaneers who were roaming around the South Pacific visited the islands and sort of sheltered in the islands. You know, they're not that easy to visit. There aren't a lot of freshwater sources, for one thing, in the islands. But there are, you know, various legends, one of which concerns, again, Floriana, where that carved stone was. And Floriana does happen to be one of the few islands that has a freshwater spring. One of the pirates who's kind of noteworthy is a guy named William Dampier, who came to the islands in the 1690s. Here he is here. And Dampier is referred to as the literary pirate because he wrote a bunch of stuff and took very, very extensive notes. and he's considered to be the first naturalist visitor to the islands. He also drew pictures of the organisms, and this is a picture that was drawn by William Dampier of a marine iguana. Kind of a little bit scary, but you know, it's not so bad, I guess. Um, the other thing that the pirates did is that they extracted a lot of stuff. Notably, they collected tortoises, not for any scientific purposes. Mostly they collected tortoises so they could eat them. And it's actually known that they harvested many thousands of tortoises. It probably put a pretty big dent in the numbers of tortoises and perhaps even drove some species extinct. And I kind of hate to tell you that what they did with the tortoises was that they would take them on board the vessels and they would keep them there for 6 months. Tortoises, giant tortoises can stay alive for a really long time without food or water. So they basically just brought them on the boats and kept them there for months and months at a time, and then eventually they would get around to eating them. So fresh meat. We then go into a period of time when the islands were more frequented by whalers and fur seal hunters. So starting in the late 1800s and going up to about 1899 or 1900. And so one of the remnants of the whalers is this guy, Post Office Bay, also on Floriana Island. If you've been to Floriana, you probably went to Post Office Bay if you were on a cruise. I'm sure they would have stopped there. This, of course, is not the same barrel that the whalers put, but the apocryphal story is that the whalers, missed home, and they set up this barrel, and they would drop off, letters and packages. And then if you were going home, you would stop off at Post Office Bay and pick up a letter and take it with you to Europe or back to England when you're on your way. So if you go to Post Office Bay now on Floriana Island, be sure to bring a letter or a postcard with you, and you can drop it in the barrel, and your guide will take the letters out of the barrel and will go through them, and you are to take any letters that you can deliver, as long as you can deliver them by hand. That's the only condition. You're not to bring them home and mail them. You are to bring them home and deliver them by hand, and it does actually work, I can tell you that. So we have a lot of logbooks like this one of whaling vessels, and we know that they did a lot of extraction of both whales and fur seals. They almost drove the Galapagos fur seals to extinction. And just in general, the rate of extraction, they took tens of thousands of whales. There's logs that show tens of thousands of whales being harvested in a period of, 6-7 years by a small handful of vessels. So it really greatly accelerated the biodiversity loss in the islands. It's probable that some species were driven to extinction. Others have been recovering, but are still really recovering since that time. They didn't only take stuff, they also introduced stuff. So probably first the pirates, but also the whalers and seal hunters introduced a bunch of things into the islands, including goats, rats, dogs, cats, and pigs. And all of these are now invasive in the islands. Meanwhile, there was actually a settler, and the first known settler in the islands was an Irish guy named Patrick Watson, and he was shipwrecked off of, again, Floriana in 1807, and he set up shop and stayed for a few years. Evidently, he grew vegetables, and he would trade these vegetables with passing vessels, and apparently, according to the stories, he mostly traded for rum, so he kind of spent his entire 3 years or however long he stayed in the islands more or less drunk, and was later described by a passing captain as wearing ragged clothes, scarce sufficient to cover his nakedness, and covered with vermin, red hair and beard matted, skin much burnt, and so wild and savage in his manner and appearance that he struck everyone with horror. He did eventually turn up on the mainland, but there are some suspicious circumstances around how he managed to get off of the islands. There is, sort of a legend that he hijacked a passing vessel and maybe killed the people who were on the boat and then made it to the mainland. It's kind of unclear. The islands were officially annexed by Ecuador in 1832, and Jose Maria Villamil became the first Governor General of Galapagos. It was his idea. He was the one who convinced the the then president of Ecuador, the first president of Ecuador, whose name was Flores. And so that is how the first island, Floriana, got its Spanish name. And that's where the first official colony was established. So the early settlers on the island, of course, were farming, to support themselves and so on. But their main industry was that they harvested a type of moss called orchil or lichen. I'm not quite sure if it's a moss or a lichen, which sounds like a really odd industry, but apparently in the early 1800s, there was quite a thriving trade in this lichen, which was used to make a natural, and I think it's still used to make a natural dye. Some species make a red dye, others make a purple dye. The first industrial, the first person to really establish industry on the island was a guy named Manuel J. Cobos, who's shown right here on the left. And Cobos founded a colony on the island of San Cristobal. There still are quite a few people in the islands with the family name Cobos. He founded a colony and a business on San Cristobal, also called Chatham, and the business was called El Progreso. They were harvesting the moss. They also were growing coffee on a plantation called El Cafetal, and they also evidently were growing and harvesting sugar cane. There's been some recent archaeological work done on El Progreso, which is if you go to San Cristobal, when you walk along the Malecon, along the shoreline, up in the hills behind that town is where Progreso is located. And there's been some recent archaeological work done there that has revealed that it's actually possible that what they were really doing at Progreso was rum running, because they found a whole big cache of rum bottles, and he had this whole elevator gravity driven train setup for getting stuff from the highlands down to the coast. So Cobos evidently, by all accounts, was not such a pleasant guy. And for example, when if a worker did something that he didn't like, he would take them to an uninhabited island and leave them there, which was essentially a death sentence. So it's perhaps not all that surprising that in the late 1800s, he actually was killed by a worker uprising at Progreso. And so meanwhile, here's Ecuador. You've got these islands. What are you going to do with a bunch of islands 1,000 kilometers offshore, shrouded in mist all the time, and very little fresh water, really hard place to live, and surrounded by shark-infested waters? Well, how about sending prisoners there? And so that's what they did. They established penal colonies right from the beginning, 1832, on Floriana and San Cristobal, and then later on Isabela. And these colonies were in use to receive mostly Ecuadorian political prisoners for about 127 years. They were only shut down. The last one, I think, was the one on Isabela, and it was shut down in 1959. If you've been to Isabela Island, you may have visited this place, which is called the Wall of Tears, which was built by prisoners on Isabela for no particular purpose. I think it was an exercise in futility, basically, and probably caused a lot of hardship among the prisoners. And so we come inevitably to the visit of Charles Darwin in 1835 on the voyage of the Beagle. Darwin is a big presence in the islands. You cannot escape him. There are t-shirts, there is everything in the islands, including this really big statue, which is on San Cristobal, near the location where he probably made landfall and came ashore on San Cristobal. It's a really big statue. A person would probably stand, up to about here, I'm thinking. And I always thought the proportions of this statue were a little weird because it looks like his arms would come down to about, below his knees or something. But he has a big presence in the islands. And a couple things that some people don't know about Darwin. One is that he was really young when he went on the Beagle. He had been hired as a companion, basically, for Captain Fitzroy, who was, by most accounts, not an altogether pleasant guy, and as a naturalist as well. And he was only 26 when they arrived in the islands. But the other thing about Charles Darwin that a lot of people don't know is that he was very, 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 very anxious to go ashore at every possible opportunity because he wanted to make collections, but also because he was horribly seasick. He spent the entire time, that whole voyage of the Beagle, being seasick. And so he was super happy anytime he got to go ashore and look around and make collections. He did not like the marine iguanas. He referred to them as imps of darkness. He thought they were horrible. He was much more intrigued by the birds, but as I mentioned briefly last time, it wasn't the finches. So here are two of the 13 or 14 species of finches that underwent that adaptive radiation into the various islands that we talked about last time. Not only was he not particularly inspired by the finches, he actually misidentified them. He didn't even realize that they were finches and didn't collect them all. Sorry, my dogs are barking in the background. I don't know if you can hear that. He was much more inspired by the mockingbirds, and he did collect all 4 species of mockingbirds. As you can see from this map, one species that occurs on these islands, including the big island of Isabella, a different species here, a different species here, and a different species here. And Darwin just thought this was really weird. Why would God, put one species that's different from the species that's on the mainland and put it here on these islands, but then make different ones for these other islands? It seemed like way too much trouble. And so that was the kind of thing that really got Darwin thinking about, how all these different species might have been related to, as he says here, number 1, and how they might have all evolved, although he wasn't using the word evolution at the time, how they might have all been related to that original ancestor. So really it was the mockingbirds more than the finches that got him thinking about all this stuff. After Darwin, and there's a lot more interesting stuff about Darwin that we could go into. I mean, Darwin didn't publish his work for a really long time after he came back from the voyage of the Beagle. One reason was that his wife was very religious, and she convinced him not to publish, not because she necessarily disagreed or something, but because she didn't want to end up in heaven without him, and he would meanwhile be in hell because he had published the theory of evolution. So she convinced him not to publish for a really long time. So after Darwin, there was a long series of scientists, and so we sort of enter a period of time that's kind of dominated by science, I guess, in the islands, really from the mid-1800s, I would say, all the way up to the present day. There were some who were catastrophists and creationists who were, visited the islands in an effort to try to disprove Darwin. Louis Agassiz is an example. Some were evolutionists who were there to try to support Darwin. One example is Thomas Huxley. And Thomas Huxley's grandfather actually had been one of Darwin's biggest supporters, who encouraged him to publish his theory of evolution. And then there was a very interesting period of scientific collectors that was really in the 20s and 30s. And we don't do ecology this way anymore. But in the early 1900s, there was a whole series of expeditions that went out to the islands to collect stuff in the name of science, like, let's collect this thing before it goes extinct, even if we drive it extinct while we're doing the collection. And so you might think that I'm exaggerating, but this guy, Royal Beck, was part of a big expedition from the California Academy of Science. They collected, are you ready for this, 76,000 specimens that they brought back. All kinds of stuff, including lots and lots of Galapagos tortoises and lots of birds, finches, mockingbirds, you name it, they collected it. 76,000. Another really famous one was William Rothschild, industrial money. I don't think Rothschild himself ever went to Galapagos. I might be wrong about that. But he did sponsor expeditions, and he famously kept about 140 some giant tortoises on his property in England. And another guy who's quite famous is William Beebe, who published a book called Galapagos World's End in the 1920s. Actually, you can still buy that book on Amazon if you're interested. And this book was really, according to my friend Diego Quiroga, who's the social anthropologist who's really done a lot of work on this idea of the narrative of the islands as a pristine natural laboratory, this book really set that whole narrative on its way, and actually is thought to have probably led to the idea that maybe we should start bringing tourists here to the islands. And then in the 1950s, UNESCO started to talk about Galapagos as a pristine natural laboratory. So before we leave and go into the sort of the modern history of the islands, and I'm gonna run out of time, and I really apologize. Sorry about that. But anyway, I just have to mention the weirdness that happened in the 1930s, again on Floriana. And there was a series of German settlers who went to Floriana. The first was a couple named the Ritters, and the second batch was a family, the Wittmers, who went in search of a sort of, pristine paradise in which to raise their son who had some health problems. And then followed by some other interesting characters, including a self-styled baroness named Eloise Wagner. And they had, it's a very long and complicated story that we don't have time to go into. And the actual truth is that no one really knows what happened. But there were mysterious disappearances and murder and mayhem and, all kinds of stuff. The Baroness actually showed up with her two lovers and a Ecuadorian manservant, and people died and they didn't get along. And one guy died from eating a tainted chicken, but he was a vegetarian. And the whole story is just really complicated. There is still a German presence in the islands. This is in Puerto Ayora on Santa Cruz, where you can visit Playa de los Alemanes, with the German beach. And there's quite an upscale sort of suburb just past this beach. So I'll leave this story because it's a little too complicated to go into, but it's kind of fun if you ever feel like delving into it. And here's the connection with Thor Heyerdahl, because when he visited the islands, Rolf Wittmer, who I think is probably this little guy, but I'm not positive, in 1947, when Thor Heyerdahl came, Rolf was 20, and he evidently took Thor Heyerdahl into the hills on Floriana and showed him this carved head and tried to convince Thor Heyerdahl that this was evidence of pre-Hispanic indigenous presence in the islands, and he thought it was a good laugh. Then we kind of end this sort of history with the U.S. military presence on Baltra. So remember, Baltra is that little island that's north of Santa Cruz, and this is where the main airport is located. And there was a U.S. military presence in the Galapagos during World War II from 1942 to 1946. They refer to it as the Rock. If you go to Baltra, if you fly into or out of Baltra, as you drive to the airport, look around, and you can very clearly see the remnants of some of the buildings left over from the base. And actually on Bartolome Island, which I've shown this picture before, evidently the U.S. Army, or probably Marine personnel, were apparently responsible for shaping this volcanic pinnacle because they used to use it for target practice. And in 2010, they found a cache of World War II bombs on Bartolome Island. So that presence, fairly recent, but it was turned over to the government of Ecuador in the late 40s. And then more recently, we have the Charles Darwin Research Station, founded in 1959, the beginnings of the tourism industry, which was a very conscious thing. Let's think about how we might bring tourists to this place. It wasn't a natural evolution, it was a conscious decision. The Parque Nacional Galapagos was created in 1970, and the islands were declared a World Heritage Site in 1978. In the 2000s, I'm going to say, UNESCO actually put it on an endangered World Heritage list because they were so worried about changes going on in the islands and the number of tourists. I think it's now been taken off of that endangered heritage list. And then finally, the Marine Reserve was established in 1998. One of the most successful, but also in many ways controversial, marine protected areas in the world. How are we doing here? We're good. We have a few more minutes. We're okay. We're good. We have 9 minutes to address our last question, which is, what is it like in the islands today? And here's some pictures of the settlements. This one is Puerto Ayora. This is the biggest one, maybe 12,000, 13,000 people living here. So it's not an insignificant town. This is Puerto Bacariza Moreno and San Cristobal. This is actually the campus of the university that I deal with in Ecuador. They have a campus in the islands, not a terrible place to go to school, in my opinion. And then this one is Puerto Villamil and Isabela, which I mentioned last time as being my most favorite of all the settlements. And this is what's left of the little settlement on Floriana, probably only about maybe less than 200 people who are still living in Floriana at this time. And so, gosh, what are the big issues in Galapagos today? There are so many of them. And all these issues are interrelated in very complicated ways. Conservation and biodiversity, invasive species management, managing the marine reserve, managing fishing, both legal and illegal fishing, the pressures of the local economy, supporting local people, energy for local people, pollution caused not just by local people, but more so by tourists, water quality, huge issue. There's very little fresh water in the islands. Waste management, again, more from tourists than from local people. And then, the big issues, tourism and ecotourism, and really how many tourists can this ecosystem handle? And then the ongoing scientific importance, of course, of the islands. I showed you a picture like this before of the sea lion sort of draped on the park benches in San Cristobal, with the saying on here, "Conservemos lo nuestro," which means let's save what is ours. And I really believe, and I feel that I've seen this over the past 10 or 11 years that I've been going to the islands, that the people in the islands get it. They get it, that they are living in a very unique place and that they need to be a part of preserving it. And yes, they need to support themselves, and yes, they need to have access to their industries and so on. But if they don't preserve it and conserve it, then they're not going to have anything left with which to make their living. So I propose to you that I'm going to super quickly, in the 7 minutes remaining, tell you 2 quick stories about current pressures in the islands today. One is about managing invasive species, and the other is about managing the marine reserve. Invasive species, big deal in the islands. Remember last time we talked about some of the characteristics of island biota. And because of all this specialization and all these very specialized innovations that have happened as a result of adaptive radiation of the species once they make it to the islands, and the lack of natural predators and things like that, island biota are very susceptible to invasive species. Having said that, 90% of the endemic species, that is, the species that only exist in Galapagos and nowhere else, 90% of them are still extant in the islands. That's really good. If you look in contrast at Hawaii, I think only about 60% of the endemic species are still extant in the Hawaiian Islands. There's a lot of problems with invasive species. They're all interesting. We don't have time to look at all of them. This is blackberry, big problem. That one was imported by people, very invasive. And actually, it turns out that plant invasives are way harder to deal with than animal invasives, for reasons that we don't have time to talk about. Rats, they've probably been there since the time of the pirates. This is the cottony cushion scale. They controlled this by bringing in ladybugs. That's been actually fairly successful, I think, biological control. This one, very difficult. This is a cat, feral kitty. And people, live in the islands, they want pets. And what happens with pets is they escape. And so feral dogs, but mostly feral cats. The cats make it much farther. And I was in Isabela one time. We were way around the northern edge of the island in an extremely remote area. And we got off the boat and got on land. And the first thing we saw was kitties, little ones. And the guides were just, distraught because they're really far from civilization being up there. So obviously they're breeding. And this particular kitty right here is chowing down on a baby marine iguana. I'm going to touch briefly on the story of the goats. So invasive goats are really a big problem in the islands. They're very destructive, and they breed like mad. So these are all goats on Isabela Island. There was a big project that was mounted starting in the late 90s, and supposedly it ended in 2006. I would actually say that The effort to control the invasive goats is ongoing. Last time I was there a year and a half ago, we saw goat poo. So they're still there. It's cost well over $6 million at this point to get rid of the goats. They've tried everything. They've tried, harvesting them for food. They've tried shooting them from helicopters. The cost has led people to say, maybe there's something better that we could be spending $6 or $10 million on than getting rid of goats, but they are super destructive. The way they did finally get rid of most of the goats was, many of you have heard this story before, was by using what's called a Judas goat. And this is not unique to Galapagos. Goats are gregarious. They like to hang out in groups. And what they do is they catch one goat and they put a radio collar with a GPS on the goat, and then they release it and it goes and joins its buddies. And once it joins its buddies, they can go and eliminate the whole group. So that's how they've managed to eliminate a lot of the goats. The other thing, I'll just finish the invasive species part. I won't have time to talk tonight about the marine reserve, but we can maybe talk about it some other time. I don't know. If you go to the islands, you will know, or if you've been, you will know that when you go through the airport, either in Guayaquil or Quito, you have to go through a second airport security entry thing, which is the biosecurity. So they'll scan your bags and they'll ask if you have any fruit. You need to do this both, there's very strong control both upon entry and upon exit. If you do island hopping and you travel from one island to the other, they will make you wash your boots before you go from one island to the next in an effort to control the movement of insects from one island to the other. They make a lot of use of sniffer dogs. This particular dog is named Darwin, and he is currently sniffing out an invasive snail. And here we have a bunch of juvenile Galapagos tortoises that were captured on the way out of the islands from somebody who was trying to smuggle them out for the exotic pet trade. So this is, they're really, really trying to keep the invasives out and to keep people from taking stuff. So if you do go to the islands, know that you cannot take anything out with you, not even a rock. Nothing leaves the islands, and they're doing their best, but it's a really big job. So I was going to talk a little bit about the Marine Reserve. I think it's, we don't have time. So I'll just say one thing and then I'll stop. Almost right on time. This has been a pretty successful Marine Reserve. It's big, but it's been pretty controversial, and there's been a lot of controversy, particularly with local fishers kind of balancing off with long distance fishing, shark finning, really bad, and I'm really begging you to never eat shark fin soup. What the big goal in this area is to try to get a big, one giant interconnected marine protected area that can really pull some of these areas together and protect them for the future. So I'm going to stop there and see if anyone has any questions. Right on time again, except that I ran out of time for my last thing.
But you're still right on time. You're still right on time. Again, Professor Burke, thank you so much. Another wonderful presentation and a great slide to end. I think this is one of the birds that has caught most people's attention when we were promoting the webinar over the last few weeks. And thanks everyone for joining us either on Zoom or on Facebook. If you're watching us on Facebook Live right now, a note that we have had to adjust our comment filters quite heavily to counteract some of the heavy spamming that we were receiving last week. So if you're unable to leave a comment underneath this video, please send us a direct message. We can get to your questions that way. And if you're watching us on Zoom, please include a comment or a question in the Q&A panel. And we have some time now to talk a little bit more with Professor Burke about whatever questions you may have. And one thing that did come through, one of the comments that came through on our Facebook page was just more of a comment that goats, cats, rats, also a massive issue in New Zealand, many other islands, I imagine. Is that the case, that this is something that's kind of problematic for a lot of island nations or islands in general?
It totally is. And here's the funny thing. I am giving another talk in March, and it's going to be on New Zealand. And I have started putting that talk together. And one of the things I'm going to say in that talk is, for those of you who were at the Galapagos talk, remember we talked about the oddities of island biota, and that is also true of New Zealand. That disharmonic biota that we talked about last time and the weird proportions. and that susceptibility to invasive species. And absolutely, that is the case as well in New Zealand and lots of other islands too. Yep.
And one question again coming through Facebook. Can you say anything about diving in the Galapagos? Are there any restrictions, kind of heavy restrictions in place for diving and being underwater, as you would have restrictions with, I guess, just about everything else in the area?
Yep, you can't go diving without a guide. I mean, yeah, I would say at all, probably. So the no take zones that you saw as I flipped past them quickly in the marine reserve, some of those locations are absolute no take. No one can visit, no one can fish, no one can do anything. Others are designated for tourism, so you can't sort of go anywhere that you want to. There are certain sites that are designated for diving. You need to go with a guide. I don't dive, but I snorkel, and it's the same with snorkeling. The you know supposedly best places to dive in Galapagos are Wolf and Darwin, which are two of the islands that are way up north. And I've heard from friends who dive that those are really spectacular. And so if you're a diver, it's perhaps worth thinking about. They take a while to get there, and you would need to charter a boat and a guide and go up there. But there's a lot of really great places to dive right around, just offshore from San Cristobal. I mean, lots of good diving, lots of good diving. But it is very restricted. I mean, one of the things I talked about last time is over the 10 or 11 years that I've been going, it's gotten more and more restrictive. So when we first started going, it was, oh yeah, let's go here or let's go there, or we would more like we would go to a place with a guide and then we would say, let's stay for 2 more hours. You can't do that anymore. It's very restricted, exactly how much time you can spend, and it's very orchestrated. And that sounds awful, but actually it's okay because they're doing a pretty good job of balancing it. So you get there and you're the only one there, or you're the only boat, or there's two boats there. So it's better. It actually is better than having lots of people, arriving all at the same time and sort of juggling for position and stuff like that. So it is restricted, but they're orchestrating it quite well, I would say, given their resources. So that's the trade-off, I think.
And just before you wrapped up the presentation, you did mention not eating shark fin soup as a way to do our little part. Are there anything? Is there anything else that we can do? Maybe collectively to prevent some of the large-scale like fleets and shark finning that happens in the area around the Galapagos?
I mean, the problem. Oops, sorry. I wanted to show you a slide and then I goofed up. The
That's okay.
problem with, so I guess to go back to one of my slides, the problem with fishing, it's really challenging. So this is the marine reserve, and the problem with the long distance fishing vessels, which are mostly Japanese vessels, they come and they hang out like this around the edge of the reserve. So this boat right here the red ones are local fishing vessels, the yellow ones are tour boats, and there's this one is an enforcement vessel. And what happens with these big long distance vessels is that they send smaller vessels into the marine reserve because they're not required, the small vessels are not required to carry GPS trackers.
Mm.
So they all hang around the outside of the reserve, send small vessels in to harvest, that come back out and dump their fish onto the big boats, and then they go back in. It's very challenging. They have a very limited number of boats with which, sorry, that's a cargo. No, that's law enforcement. These are cargo vessels. They just don't have a lot of capacity for policing this very large area. So, I mean, I would say in terms of us doing stuff, in terms of doing things in Galapagos that will have an impact on Galapagos, eat sustainable, certified sustainable seafood is the main thing. The shark finning issue is an actual issue in Galapagos because there's a lot of finning. When we were there about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a vessel called Fair Maria that was caught with hundreds of shark fins. And it's a brutal practice. They cut the fins off and let the sharks go to die. They waste the entire rest of the ship. It's not even like they're harvesting the whole shark and eating it. I mean, it's a terrible practice, and we really need to stop shark finning all over the world. And really, I think do everything that we all can to promote sustainable fisheries altogether.
And I guess partly tied into that question and this issue, is there a way that we can expand the reserve itself, or the perimeter of the reserve? That's one of the questions coming in off of Facebook, is why is the reserve itself not bigger, take up more of an area in that part of the ocean?
Well, so one reason is that Ecuador doesn't have control over. So the black lines on this diagram is the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ of Ecuador, and this is Panama. This is probably Ecuador, or Ecuador is here and here, of course, because it's around Galapagos. I mean, that's a huge area in the first place. How would Ecuador ever police that? But they don't have control over anything outside of that. That's by international convention. So one of the interesting things about this marine reserve is this bit right here. And what happens, because fish don't care, you draw a line on a map, they don't care. Sharks, they don't care. They're going to swim back and forth here. So this is another place where a lot of the long distance fishing vessels hang out. They hang out in this area here, hoping to get fish that are swimming outside of the protected areas. Another thing, I mean, it's a very complex issue, and it's not just this part of the world. We have our own task to do in terms of protecting marine areas in Canada. We're not doing badly for marine protected areas in Canada, but we have stuff that we can do, and we have, dialogues that we can enter in the international community. For example, there's been discussions about trying to get a marine protected area that would go all the way up the coast, not just this, but all the way up the coast of Central America, Mexico, the United States, and connect with the marine protected areas in Canada. Now, the issue, though, in Galapagos is you got a bunch of people fishing here for a living. That's what they do. That's their job. They've lived there for generations. They fish. And there's been a lot of conflict over the years about the no-take zones, violent conflict in some cases, and death threats and stuff like that. So locally in Galapagos, there's a lot of balance in terms of the environmental management of the marine reserve. Like I said, I think there's some kind of a balance has been reached where a lot of the people who used to fish are now switching to catch and release, and they're switching to tourism. So they're taking tourists. They're now allowed to take tourists on their boats. So instead of fishing, they're catch and release, and they're doing tourism. And so we're finding our way to some kind of a balance there. But there are 26,000 people living in those islands who need to be supported. Or hey, not. I mean, what would you do if you were the government of Ecuador? You could move all those 26,000 people out, or you could make it so that only Brad and Angelina, well, they're not together anymore, but they used to vacation in Galapagos. Maybe we should make it so only the really wealthy can go there and have a smaller footprint. Or maybe we should make it so that only scientists can go there. Or maybe we should make it that only backpackers can go there. Backpackers tend to have sort of a smaller footprint. I mean, etc. You see what I mean? That there's a lot of discussion about how to manage the impacts of people in the islands, and how to balance all of these competing interests.
Yeah, complex issues for sure, and a lot of different stakeholders to manage as well. We've reached the top of the hour and the end of another fascinating presentation, another well-attended presentation, both on Zoom and on Facebook. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight, for submitting your comments and your questions, and a lot of good commentary of just general, like, awesome presentation, great presentation, Barbara's wonderful, that kind of stuff. We won't get to all those comments, but they're all absolutely true. So thank you again to Professor Barbara Burke, a geologist and professor at the University of Toronto. Thank you again to Credit Valley Conservation for their support in making this webinar possible. Again, you can learn more about all of their work in the Credit Valley watershed at cvc.ca. And thank you for watching and spending some of your time with us tonight. We do appreciate the support of people like you who care about nature, and your donations help us continue to offer programs like this on top of all the conservation work that we do actually in Riverwood. So if you're able, we would appreciate a donation at the riverwoodconservancy.org. That's all for us tonight. Thank you again for joining us. Once again, Professor Barbara Burke, thank you for your time and your expertise. Please stay safe, and we will see you again, hopefully very soon. Take care.